Okay, it looks like we've got a nice crowd assembled. So good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our third season of In the Adirondack Library. I'm Liz Bellier, Public Programs Manager here at the Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Mountain Lake. The Adirondack Experience Library is the largest and most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, and government documents related to the history of the Adirondack region. Through this series, we're thrilled to bring you inside the library, exploring the people, places, and ideas that have shaped Adirondack life, history, and culture. In the Adirondack Library runs from October through May, and we invite you to join us on the first Monday of each month for lively conversations with authors and researchers whose work deepens our understanding of this remarkable region. You can find upcoming dates along with details about each speaker and their books at theadkx.org. And we are thrilled to once again partner with North Country Public Radio and to welcome back Mitch Tyke, station manager at NCPR and host of Northwords as our series interviewer. Northwords airs on the fourth Friday of each month from 12 to 1 p.m., featuring interviews, field recordings, and stories that remind us what makes the North Country such a distinctive and inspiring place. And of course, tonight's featured author, Phil Terrie, has been exploring the story of wilderness in the Adirondacks for more than 50 years, both in the archives and in the backcountry. A former researcher at the Adirondack Experience and a professor of American and Environmental Studies, Phil holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton University and a PhD from George Washington University. Wild Forest Lands is his sixth book on Adirondack history. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to Phil, who will introduce his book. Then Mitch will lead the conversation before we open it up for audience questions. We encourage your participation this evening. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature and check the chat for important links. Finally, we hope that you will consider purchasing Phil's book through your local independent bookstore to continue supporting authors and small businesses across the region. Thanks again for joining us, and without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Phil.
Okay, thank you so much for that delightful introduction. I am really pleased to be here. You know, the Adirondack Experience, where I worked many, many years ago, is very close to my heart, and I always want to know what's going on there, and I wish it well in everything it does. Okay, my book. I have written a book about wilderness, and it's kind of a meditation on wilderness, and about the fact that it is controversial, it's ambiguous, it's vague. It means different things to different people. It has negative connotations for some people. And I wanted to talk about how it has meant, what it has meant to me in a number of ways, and what it has meant in New York history and American history. So it's, in many respects, it's a series of connected essays about wilderness with a historical thread linking them. And another thread that links them is that in all cases, I'm looking for meaning. What has wilderness meant in American history? What has wilderness meant in New York history? What is the meaning of the constitutional provision that protects wilderness in the Adirondacks and also in the Catskills? What has wilderness meant in my professional life and in my personal spiritual life? And all of these things, I hope, come together in this book. Now, I started out when I was working at what was called the Adirondack Museum in the early 70s, and I read a very important book that meant a lot to me at the time, and it continues to mean a lot, and that's Wilderness and the American Mind by an intellectual historian named Roderick Nash. And that book influenced me in enormous ways, and it tells a very satisfying narrative about how Americans went from hostility to wilderness, we've got to get rid of it as soon as possible, to appreciation and devotion to wilderness to the extent that we enshrine protection of wilderness in our federal statutes. Part of the reason that I wrote this book is that over the last few years, I have become increasingly aware of the problems with the way Roderick Nash uses the word wilderness. It's unreflective. It's whitewashing American history. It homogenizes American history. And I wanted to make corrections to the way I have talked about this word over my entire professional career. To me, wilderness, originally when I was a teenager and a young man, wilderness was just a reality. It's something that's there. I now understand that wilderness is what we call a cultural construction, that we project onto the natural world what we want to see. I realize that when we talk about wilderness in older terms, we're erasing thousands of years of indigenous history in the United States and North America and in the Adirondacks. Um, One of the books that got me started on this whole thing is by Melissa Otis, called Rural Indigenousness, which is a great corrective to a lot of way a lot of historians, including myself, have thought about the Adirondacks as a place that was discovered by white people. Well, it wasn't. Uh, Indigenous people have been living and working and doing their thing in the Adirondacks for a long, long time. Uh, I've come to think that the only way we can use the word wilderness in a way that makes any sense is as an administrative classification of land. And that's the way it is used in the Adirondacks now. We have it in the state land master plan. Wilderness is this. These are the things you can do there. These are the things you can't do there. It's strictly an administrative classification. Okay, one of the other things that I wanted to do in this book was talk about how the word wilderness has come to be so important in the political and judicial history of the Adirondacks. And that stemmed from my participation in a trial a few years ago about snowmobile trails in the Adirondacks. And I bet many of our viewers tonight know about that trial. And one of the things that that trial did was try to figure out what did the authors of the 1894 Constitution mean when they said forever kept as wild forest lands, hence the title of my book, and nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. What do they mean by timber? And I spent considerable time in this book talking about what I think they meant. And it turns out it's pretty clear that they did not mean what the state of New York insisted they meant during this litigation. And then I finish up the book with some thoughts about how do we protect wilderness in the Adirondacks uh, with a constituency that may be shrinking or changing very seriously, that's for sure, and in the face of the inevitable climate change that we're going to be dealing with in the next, where we are dealing with it already. It's not raining anywhere up in the Adirondacks. And the decades to come will put enormous pressure on the protections we have for wilderness in the Adirondacks. Okay, that's a rough, very quick attempt to show what I'm up to in this book. I'm Mitch.
Well, and I think you answered all the questions that I had. So no. That was actually a really great outline. And Phil Terrie, thank you so much. We're delighted to have you on the series, and I'm delighted to chat with you this evening. And I guess you kind of set a stage for where this book falls in your academic and your overall life in the wilderness, both academic and just interest in the wilderness arena. But um, I guess let me take a step back, because you, at a very young age, were not immediately connected to wildlands. What first got you out into the woods, and why did it captivate you as much as it did?
Well, it's a story my children have heard a lot of times. I hope they're not viewing right now. I was 17 years old in high school, had a summer job lined up. I grew up in West Virginia. The summer job collapsed at around April of my senior year. My parents said, "You better find yourself a job real fast." And there was a teacher who worked at a camp somewhere in the northeastern United States. I had no idea where it was. And it turned out it was on Long Lake, New York. I said, "Can I get a job there?" And 2 weeks later, he said, "Yep, we got a job for you." And I arrived, excuse me, in Long Lake. I was 17, just recently graduated from high school, had no idea what I'd gotten myself into. And within weeks, I had found my true love. in place, that is. And it completely changed my life. And the camp that I worked at was called Adirondack Wilderness Camp. And the whole point of the camp was to have every boy out in the woods for as long as possible, as much throughout the summer. And we would finish the year with backpacking trips that lasted 2 weeks. It just completely changed my life. And then one of the people that worked at that camp was Bill Werner, who was a curator at the Adirondack Museum. And after a rather desultory attempt at graduate school after I finished college, I asked Bill if I could get a job at the museum where he worked, because I was very interested in local history and also needed a job. And he said, yep, we'll hire you as a research assistant. And so I spent 2 years just sitting in the library reading all the books in there, and not all of them, but a lot of them, and became utterly absorbed by the wonderful literature of Adirondack history. And in the meantime, I was getting out in the woods as much as I possibly could.
It's amazing. Not many people can say that a summer job they had when they were 17 years old really would shape the rest of their life. Not just for the job, but the mentor that you got from being in that job.
Yeah, it was a remarkable set of coincidences. And the camp was it was a boat access only camp, north end of Long Lake. And I now have a boat access only camp on the north end of Long Lake. So the north end of Long Lake has been the center of my spiritual universe for half a century or more.
And it should be noted the camp has not been there since the early 70s.
Oh, it folded in 71 was the last year of the camp. It's now Forest Reserve. I try to get up there every summer.
Can you give us a sense for what your own approach and your own understanding of what wilderness meant was at that early point in your life?
I think it was very much shaped by Roderick Nash. Nash's book is a wonderful book. I do spend time criticizing it and showing how it's a book of its time. It's not a book that was written last week. It was written in the 60s. And my appreciation of wilderness came from a number of different approaches, a number of different factors, contingencies, that just the aesthetic appeal of what looks like untouched country. I began to learn to what an extent it has been touched over the years, over the centuries. The joy of being out there for days and weeks at a time without hearing a motor, without hearing a radio, the camaraderie of being with other people in the backcountry, the connection that through Nash I perceived that it had with American history, that Americans had. This is sort of a Henry Jackson, Turner thesis that American character was forged in the wilderness. We now know that that's an incredibly superficial and pretty much useless observation. But I was a teenager, so hadn't figured out that stuff yet.
When we're teens, we are looking for simple answers.
We are indeed, and I was certainly, and I found them, and to the extent that for a long time I was able to ignore the factors of this entire story that challenged my assumptions about wilderness itself. And I began going to once I got a teaching job, went back to graduate school and got a teaching job and began going to professional meetings, and one of which was the American Society for Environmental History. And a lot of people were very suspicious of the whole notion of wilderness for a number of reasons. And one of the major ones was, of course, that an older sense of wilderness seems to presuppose something like pristineness or virginity in the woods. And when we realized that there were millions and millions of people living in North America before the Europeans got here, and that they'd been living there for a long time, it becomes obvious after a while that what a white man means by wilderness is not what a Native American means by wilderness. And that becomes even more complicated when we realize that what a educated fairly affluent white man who lives in New York and maybe works on Wall Street means by wilderness, and what a person who lives in the Adirondacks year round and maybe guides that other man for a living means by wilderness. We have a lot of vagary there, a lot of failure to overlap, and a lot of people not really listening to what other people might be saying about this phenomenon at the time. And so all of those things became layered onto all the original assumptions that I brought to this subject. And so what I'm trying to do in this book, which believe me is the last book, uh, is try to work through these ambiguities, these vagaries, these complexities, these challenges to the way that not only I thought, but I think an awful lot of other people have thought about this subject.
Why do you think it's important for us to even have something designated as wilderness? You know, the idea that some forms of nature should be different than other forms of nature. Why are we so vested in that term?
Well, only some of us are. There's a lot of people that think that's absurd. Uh, I
But
think that,
historically, why has it been so
yeah,
important for America to have wilderness?
um, well, because those people with their that control our policymaking machinery have had a good time out there. They think it's important to understand that Euro-American culture was formed on the edges of the wilderness. Even that's a overstatement, because actually most of Euro-American culture was formed in the cities, because that's where the people were. But it is historically interesting. It is also spiritually satisfying, and this is the part that it's very hard to make the case. It is a very much like a religious an article of faith, that we find something that is moving, spiritually moving in country, as much left alone as we can in the early 21st century. That is not a city park, which is wonderful. I love city parks. It's not an agricultural landscape. Those are wonderful too. We all have to eat, and they're very satisfying aesthetically. It's not a city. I love cities too. I love to go to New York and Chicago or whatever. Um, it's something different from the places where we spend our time, and that's another part of the problem. That most of the people who make an issue out of wilderness live somewhere else,
Mm.
And that is a source of conflict, of stress and strife. Sometimes as we work out in our rather odd ways how we establish and enforce policy.
I'm struck by how important it was, especially sort of in the early history of our cultural concept of wilderness, for some people, how important it was to think of themselves as the first person ever to set eyes on a particular area,
Mm-hmm.
as though there were no people that were there before them.
Yeah, that is an odd phenomenon, and I can't explain it entirely, uh, or maybe not even at all, but it was like that. I mean, we know that when Verplanck Colvin stood on the edge of Lake Terror of the Clouds in 1872 and was absolutely sure he was the first white man or the first person ever to be there, which seems a little unlikely given the millennia. Uh, but it was important. And I think a lot of that stems from anti-urbanism, a lot of doubt about the way American civilization is going. It's becoming industrialized, urbanized, hopelessly commercial. I think there's a sense among an awful lot of people, usually unacknowledged, that something that human beings mess the place up. And this is before we had really any understanding of pollution or the sort of things that we know now that you can't even see. Uh, and I think that it has been largely an anti-modernist impulse, and that the so-called primitive, poorly defined, uh, has virtue in it that the so-called civilized does not. Now, the more you pick that apart, the more it crumbles. But I think that was an important impulse that a lot of people felt as they encountered wild country for the first time in their lives, and then did it over and over again. And so they had to tell themselves a lot of different stories while they were doing it.
Just a reminder to our audience that if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. That should be at the bottom of your screen. I'll be happy to take questions as we go, especially as they're relevant to the things that we're talking about. You don't have to sit on your hands for the next 40 minutes or anything. But Phil Terrie, one of the other things I was struck by in your writing, you were saying a moment ago that, no one really asked the Native Americans their attitude towards the concept of wilderness, or whether what we think of as wilderness was really wilderness to them. You also make the point that no one asked the women of their time, of these explorers' times, what their attitudes towards wilderness was either.
True, that's true. Nobody did. We know that most women were denied access to the wilderness in the 19th century. There's a sort of a golden age of of Adirondack wilderness narratives from about 1840 to 1890 or so. And there's some wonderful books and articles and magazines and book length discussions of camping trips. They're all by men. They're all by white men. They're all by educated white men who come from Boston or Albany or Philadelphia, outside the area. And women were largely left out, and they were left out of my treatment of this era too. Um, Partly because I didn't occur to me to think more broadly, and that's embarrassing. Partly because it was white men who made the decisions at that time too. And what I was aiming for in my earlier years was to try to figure out, how did we end up with this constitutional provision that protects wilderness and the Adirondacks? And that's what we now is numbered Article 14, Section 1 of the New York Constitution. And of course, women couldn't even vote in those days. So I wanted to know how we got this. But I think that anybody studying something like this now, or anybody writing a book with a subtitle "In the American Mind," as if there is one unified American mind, would have to acknowledge diversity. There is no one American mind, and you certainly can't look at a bunch of white people and say that's the American mind. It's a regrettable part of our historiography, not just here but everywhere. And so one of the things I wanted to do was address the lapses of other histories of this.
Well, and in fairness to you, as you would have combed the Adirondack Experience library and other sources, there were relatively few contemporaneous accounts of from women or non-whites that would have appeared in those collections.
There were that's true, but if you dig around, you can find things out there. For when I was writing Contested Terrain, the last book I wrote about the Adirondacks before this one, I was beginning this process, and I discovered the collection of diaries that had been kept by women in Minerva in the middle of the 19th century. Very moving, touching diaries of what it was like to live there in those times, and to be lonely all the time, one thing. And so that's not the wilderness that a minister from Boston experiences when he's enjoying Racket Lake in 1869, with a guide doing all the work for him.
Aside from the fact that it is where you ended up, is there something you think about New York State and the Adirondacks in particular that make both of them kind of an ideal case study for our attitudes and approaches for designating wilderness?
Oh, there's so much, really. One is the body of literature that we have, because the Adirondacks was so close to metropolitan areas in the 19th century, when so much of this thought process is occurring. We have just a rich literature of what were people thinking, what were they doing, on the Bog River in 1855. Who was out there? What were they doing? And all that. So we got the literature. We also have the fact that New York is a relatively wealthy, forward-looking state, and it incorporated into its constitution something that no other state has done. And as you know, this book, I spent a lot of time looking at the constitutional provision that protects the forest reserve, trying to figure out what were they thinking at the time, because this is so important to litigation. And another thing that got me started on this book, in addition to all the things I've already mentioned tonight, is my participation in the litigation that led to a very important decision from the Court of Appeals that came down in 2021. And studying, word by word, comma by comma, what was going on at these constitutional conventions that both originally inscribed these words in the Constitution in 1894 and then discussed it every time we had another convention. And that would have been 1915, 1938, and 1967. So I take a really close look at these constitutions and at the judicial history where there's been challenges to this in the courts. And we do have a kind of history because of our Constitution that no other state has. Not even the federal government. We have a national wilderness system in this country. It's statutory. It could be abolished tomorrow. And believe me, there are members of Congress who would love to do just that. There are members of Congress who would take Yosemite and sell it to Disney. In New York, it's much better protected. Matter of fact, our forest reserve may be among the best protected lands on the planet. Because it's so hard to change things around. It can be done, and it has been done, but constitutions should be amended when the time arrives, but it shouldn't be easy. And so because of our Constitution, we have a feature to our wilderness that nobody else has in North America. And if there's anywhere else, I don't know about it.
Do you think it's asking a little much of the people who enshrined this in our Constitution in the late 19th century to be trying to figure out exactly what they meant by commas and the use of the word timber and all this when we're interpreting it 130 years later?
I'm not asking them to interpret it. I'm trying to interpret what they wrote. And of course, constitutions tend to be written by lawyers who try to take care to achieve precision, to try to minimize ambiguity, uncertainty. But these are words, and words are circular. They're repetitive. They are personal. Different people have different things in mind when they use the same words. As anybody who's ever had a conversation with anybody in their life knows, we get confused sometimes. Language is the only tool we have to achieve clarity, and it's a flawed tool. I love it. I love language. I love playing with it. I love working with it, but it's problematic. And so I think that it's only fair. That's what we do. We try to figure out what they had in mind, even though there is no one. When they voted for this provision in 1894, probably sometime in August, you had hundreds of people in that hall who were voting on this thing, and you probably had many, many different understandings of what each word in there, maybe not the word and or but the key words like timber and wild and forest, you probably had some degrees of variability among the understandings of that word. But what we can do is show what did the words generally mean at the time. And that's what we did in our litigation.
Well, and you bring up the word timber, and it is significant that they use the word timber and not the word tree or wood.
It certainly is. That's a nice introduction to another major part of this book. And as most people know, the Article 14, Section 1 says, "Nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed." And in a series of litigations where the state of New York has interpreted the Constitution in certain ways. They have insisted that the word timber, at the time it was first used in our Constitution, meant only those trees large enough for construction members or the timbers of a ship or something like that, big merchantable trees. And therefore, little trees don't count. The state has insisted that little trees, 1 inch, 3 inches, do not count, and are not to be considered about cutting, removing, or destroying, which is what the Constitution forbids. Well, we showed in a number of ways, beginning with the 1892 Webster's International Dictionary, which was the dictionary of record for American usage at the end of the 19th century, that the definitions of timber were far broader than what the state has insisted that it meant at the time. In the very first definition in that dictionary, for instance, it says what the state meant: construction, building ships, but also utensils and tools. Timber large enough for that, a hammer, a wooden spoon. It also, in further definitions, it talks about stems. It's not just the main trunk. So we can never know what everybody at that convention had in mind when they chose that word. Or somebody originally wrote it down. The Conservation Committee, probably David McClure, who was from New York, and we don't know if he ever even came to the Adirondacks, wrote that word into provision. What they all thought, we don't know, but we can show that at the time, in the common parlance of the day, the word had a broader, far broader meaning than what the state insisted in its testimony and documentation at a series of trials about what does the Constitution protect. And in fact, the word trees was added to that provision in 1915 at the first constitutional convention following the one of 1894. They decided, well, somebody might misinterpret this, so we should make it more precise. And so they added trees and to the Constitution. So it would be, nor shall the trees and timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. That Constitution, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Forest Reserve, was voted down by the people in November of 1915, and so that provision did not become part of our Constitution. It was too progressive in other areas for the state to swallow. And then it was discussed at great length at Constitutional Convention of 1838 and in 1967, and they decided to leave it exactly the same without changing a comma.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions already. And again, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. One from Anthony that you've touched on a little, or at least alluded to, but let me read it. He first comments that I think that it's important to maintain our history and perspective on wilderness because there are people, especially the rich and those in power, who are doing everything in their power to destroy and eliminate it for basically monetary gain. How do you view the current administration's approach to cashing in on our country's wilderness?
Well, gosh, I don't care for it. I think that I think the people of this country made it pretty clear that they want some part of our public domain to be left alone, and I think that is so far been the operative assumption. So far, there have not been any significant attacks on wilderness. There was an attempt to open up Bureau of Land Management lands in the West in the One Big Beautiful Bill, and that was voted down and led by Western congressmen who decided, no, we better keep these protected for now. I think that, I think that the efforts of the rich to extract every nickel from every parcel of land in the country have been successfully opposed over time, largely by a lot of other rich people. We should note, the fact that we have the forest reserve that we do have in the Adirondacks to this right now is not entirely, but to a certain extent, the result that a lot of that forest was owned by wealthy people and taken pretty good care of for a long time, and before some of it eventually became part of the public domain. So if you care about wilderness, or if you care about clean air or clean water or keeping the temperature stable, it is in our interest to resist the efforts of capital to make profits off of all these things that belong to all of us. The Forest Preserve belongs to all the people of New York, and as long as that constituency wants it, they will have it. If they decide it's not important to them anymore, it will eventually not be there.
What do you think the ideal arena for having these debates is? I mean, you mentioned the constitutional conventions, but then from there, the debate moves into the sort of the general policy arena, and there at every step along the way, it is easy for wilderness policy or public lands policy to get bogged down in sometimes the bigger picture surrounding the Constitution. Is there an ideal place for this kind of stuff to be discussed?
Oh, no, democracy is messy. A lot of other people have pointed this out. I'm not the first one to notice it. It's a deeply flawed system, but it doesn't seem to be anyone out there that's any better. The Soviet Union, which was a demand economy and everything done from the top down, had the worst environmental record of any major country in the planet for decades. It's messy. I can't think of a better way to do it. We do it on all these different fronts. We do it in constitutions, we do it in our courts, we do it in our media, we do it in obscure books by professors with lots of footnotes that very few people read. And this is it's an endless effort, and it has to be waged on every front you can think of. And it's messy, and it ain't going to change.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, what do they say? That democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's been attributed to Winston Churchill, but
Mm.
probably he didn't say it.
Yeah. Eric writes a question and asks, can you cite some adverse consequences that have arisen as a result of the misinterpretation of wilderness?
Yes. I'm not sure if it's precisely as wilderness, but I think that in our efforts, our national efforts to protect large open spaces, we have ignored the people who might already be there. For instance, in Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon are that are two of our treasured national parks. Indigenous people were thrown out. Yosemite, there was an indigenous population, and they were forced to leave. No one should ever go into Yosemite without thinking about that and about how that can be addressed. To justice, environmental justice covers a lot of things. It's not just the fact that the poor neighborhoods are the ones with the most pollution. It's also who's been on the land. It's not a wilderness issue, but I've been reading a lot in the last few weeks about how indigenous people were just pushed aside when New York built the Erie Canal, which was opened in 1825. We're celebrating the 200th anniversary of that. And the Haudenosaunee would like to point out that, wait a minute, this was not just a wonderful success story for New York State. For some people, it was a disaster.
There's a connection, though, to what you write about in this book, because at one point, one of the big arguments for making sure that the forest preserve existed was to preserve the ability to deliver water to the Erie Canal, wasn't there?
That's right. The Erie Canal is always very closely connected to the Adirondacks. As we all should know, when the Constitutional Convention was sitting in 1894, there were two main arguments for doing something about the Adirondacks. One was to protect this as a recreational retreat, the spiritual mecca that is so important to a country becoming intensely urbanized and industrialized. The other was that so much of the water that feeds the Erie Canal and the Hudson River comes from the Adirondacks. And the Erie Canal did make New York the Empire State. It did make New York the financial capital of the world. And if there's no water in the Erie Canal or the Hudson River, New York commerce comes to a grinding halt. And so the notion was, the fear was that logging, which at that time was practiced very irresponsibly, with no thought to the consequences of clear cutting mountain slopes, that the Hudson River and the Erie Canal, instead of being stable and having water in it all the time, would be subject to endless cycles of drought and flood, and that these commercial arteries would not be useful in the way they had been for decades at that point. So probably without that argument, the forest reserve, as we know it, would probably not have been created. Although if you look at the record of the Constitutional Convention of 1894, there's a very strong sentiment, probably an equally strong sentiment for the recreational importance of this to the entire state, that this is something that the state of New York needs. It needs the watershed protection, and it needs this wilderness retreat that is becoming more and more important to the mental health of the state.
Speaking of recreation, you mentioned earlier the legislation or the court case in which you were an expert witness surrounding snowmobiling in the Adirondacks. But well before that, recreation was at the center of a debate over cutting trees in advance of the 1932 Winter Olympics. What can you tell us about the effort to build the bobsled track at that point?
Okay, that's a really important story in Adirondack history. It's been touched on by a number of historians. As you know, in the late 20s, Lake Placid was awarded the Winter Olympics that were going to take place in 1932. The local authorities were looking around for a place to have a bobsled run, and the place they thought was the best was in the Sentinel Range outside Lake Placid, and that was state land. And the legislature just passed a law, said, okay, we're going to build a bobsled run in the Forest Reserve. The Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks, which was probably the only green lobby, green organization monitoring things in the Adirondacks at the time, says, no, I don't think you can do that. That's a violation of the Constitution. It says right here that nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. And this worked its way through the courts and eventually went to the Court of Appeals. And in 1930, the Court of Appeals agreed with the association and said, yes, the cutting that you have in mind for this bobsled run is too much. Now, it did not resolve the issue. It said things like a reasonable amount is permissible, or who defines reasonable? How do we know? But it did give a number that this many trees in this much area is too much. So the state could assume, and did, that anything slightly less than that was okay. But in any case, the bobsled run was not built there. They ended up building it on private land that belonged to the Lake Placid Club, and it's now part of the Van Hoevenberg Olympic Center. And so that was the first of three major decisions that help us try to narrow our understanding, get closer to what intent was. And I feel we should be very careful using the word intent, because that creeps into original intent. And that can be a Procrustean bed that locks us into things. And so I don't want to do that. I want to be open to reasonable interpretations as we proceed. The next one of these court decisions was in the Catskills. It was the state wanted to build some ski trails, and also wanted to build a very large parking lot on state land. And a nearby club, the Balsam Lake Anglers Club, decided, we think you're going too far, and sued the state. And eventually the courts in that decision said, no, we think that a reasonable interpretation of the Constitution says that the amount of cutting that the state declares it needs to do for these amenities is not too much. And so we had this much is too much, this much is okay. And everything continues for a while. And then in 2013, the state, or earlier in the 21st century, the whole plan for community connector trails linking certain towns in the central Adirondacks is proposed. And environmentalists, we think you're cutting too many trees here. Started in the courts in 2013, and 8 years later, the Court of Appeals agreed and said that's too much cutting. And it also said, if you want these trails built, you can always amend the Constitution, which is entirely correct.
In some ways, this is a little like the decision surrounding pornography, right? You know, we don't have an exact definition, but we know it when we see it.
Yeah, that was Potter Stewart, one of the judges who said that. Yeah, yeah. I feel the same way about wilderness. I know it when I see it. It's the only definition of wilderness that I had settle on is that as a land classification system. It does not mean virginity. It does not mean pristine. It does not mean untouched, undiscovered, all those things. That's ahistorical.
We had another comment, this one from Eileen, who writes, interesting thoughts on words and meanings that Shiver Me Timbers has left the shaking ship and now taken to the woods.
Very good. Thank you.
We do have still a few minutes left, somewhere in the order of 10 minutes or so. So time to include a couple more of your questions anyway. So if feel free to drop them into the Q&A. You come at this issue from an interesting perspective as someone who lives outside the Adirondacks for most of the time, but also has, I don't know, plenty of, I would say street cred, but they're more like dirt road cred. Having had this land on Long Lake for so long, how do you weigh the opinions of people within the blue line versus those who, you know, largely make the policy from outside the blue line? Should there be a greater weight given to people who try to make their living?
That's a very, very important question, and everybody gets a voice. Everybody gets to say so. If we're talking about the Forest Reserve belongs to the people of New York. It does not belong to the people who live inside the Blue Line or inside the 12 Adirondack counties and the 4 Catskill counties. So I think it is perfectly legitimate for the state of New York, through its elected officials, through its executive agencies, to be managing the Forest Reserve. Although I think sometimes the state of New York does not do a very good job of it. That's why we have to sue them now and then to get them to abide by the Constitution. I think that over the years, the local voice at the very beginning was completely ignored. When the Constitution was being written in 94, when the park was being established in 1892, when the park was established in 1892, if you read the legislation, there is no acknowledgement of the fact that thousands of people are living there at that moment when they voted it into existence. What's going to happen to those towns? Nobody even considered that. I think the legislature believed that eventually the state would own it all. That quickly became impossible. The state will never own it all. I think we're probably getting very close to the park we're going to have, which is roughly half forest reserve, half private land. I think that over, at least since the creation of the park agency in 1971, the local voice has been given far more say. I mean, it's been listened to a lot more, and to the extent that the local representation on the park agency is way disproportionate to its population, with respect to the rest of New York. And we have efforts to acknowledge the fact that rural life is difficult. It's difficult everywhere, not just in the Adirondacks. In fact, I think statistics will show that it's a little bit better in the Adirondacks than a lot of rural America. And running a small business is hard. It's hard particularly in a seasonal economy. And I think the state has taken great efforts to try to level the playing field a little bit. You can walk into a lot of bars in the Adirondacks, and somebody eventually will say, "Oh, those bird watchers in the state, they just want us all out of here." Uh, that is ridiculous. Nobody with any responsible role in our affairs wants that, envisions that, would even be interested in that. I think the state has done a lot to make life in the Adirondacks a little bit better. It's hard in Western New York. Allegheny County is not a rich county. It's a poor county. Cattaraugus County is a poor county, and they don't have a forest reserve. They don't have a park agency. They don't have a private land plan. And so rural life is difficult. And the Adirondackers have been doing this for years are people of amazing talent. It's also important to recognize that there is no unified Adirondack voice either. There's a lot of people that live in the park who love the protections that the forest is getting and that open space in general is getting. And there's no unified single get rid of the park agency voice out there. That was a little bit wandering off your question, but I want to get that in.
No, I think it. Yeah, no, I think it speaks to what I was asking about. We have two more questions. One from Eric, who wants to know, do you have any thoughts regarding the pending sale of the Whitney lands near Long Lake?
I do have some thoughts. I want the state to buy it, but the governor has not called me to ask my opinion on that. I think it is not too late that the state could move now and get aggressive and do something about getting most of that land in the forest reserve. I think it is the last major piece of private land in the park, and it is dead center in the park. I would really like to see the state get that land. Will it? I have no idea. No, if there's negotiations going on, they are very secret. Nobody I know has a clue what's going on. I think Whitney Park is a treasure that should belong to the people of New York.
And Susan says, similarly, what percentage of original voices still exist, those land-owning descendants of pre-1971 whose stake could be considered and weighed?
I have no idea. I don't know what persistence there is, what the genealogies are of families who were back before the park agency are there now. I know people are moving in and out as they do everywhere. I think we often put too much emphasis on these kinds of roots. I think a person who moved to Indian Lake 2 years ago has just as much a right to talk about what's happening out there as someone whose great-great-great-grandfather lived there. And that's the way we do it in a democracy. I think there's a lot of different voices, and there's a lot of change going on. And, the Adirondack population is aging, as it is in all of rural America. Our school populations are getting to the point where they're not viable in certain school districts. There's a crisis to be dealt with there down the road. It's hard for young families with children to find work in the Adirondacks. If you graduate from Indian Lake High School, Central School, and go to college, as a lot of them do, you're probably not coming back because the jobs are in our metropolitan areas. And there's a huge churning of our populations in all Adirondacks towns, from the big ones like Saranac Lake to the tiny ones like Pine.
The questions are flooding in now. We have one more, this one from an anonymous attendee. With the cutting back of federal funding for scientific endeavors, are there any robust local and state institutions that can pick up the slack for research on invasives and diseases like beech leaf disease?
Oh boy, that's a big deal, isn't it? We do have two colleges at work in the Adirondacks. Paul Smith College, which is an institution I always wish the best for in so many ways, and the School of Environmental Science and Forestry has a big campus in Newcomb, and they are doing research on everything. ESF and Paul Smith's are institutions that are absolutely fundamental to everything that's going on in the Adirondacks, and we should be aware of what they're doing and support them in any way we can. So we're doing a lot. I lost you, Mitch. What? You there? Okay.
Here I am.
Okay.
Before we wrap up, you finished the book with a look forward to what might be the Constitutional Convention of 2038. Can you give us your thoughts for what the kinds of issues regarding wilderness that you would expect to be on the agenda in what is that, 13 years?
Yeah, it's not that far off, is it?
Yeah.
Uh, and it will have been since 1967, since we had a constitutional convention, and New York has never gone that long without a major consideration of its chief governing document. I think there'll be all kinds of things that will come up there, and the Adirondacks will not be at the top of most people's priorities. The redistricting, the judiciary has always been Byzantine in this state. But I think that climate change is the big threat. That's the number one thing that's looming out there. Can we keep our Article 14, given the fact that a lot of our native species may be dying off? Will there be efforts to try to manage a rapidly changing forest? Will it be rapid or will it not be rapid? We don't know. I think that there will be much discussion of a need to re-examine Article 14 at another constitutional convention because of climate change, which wasn't the case anytime previously. My feeling is leave it alone. I think that when we have a problem with our environment, and when we immediately, and it's because we've meddled with it, we've manipulated it somehow, the immediate reach to a further manipulation to take care of that problem, which we already created, is anthropogenic hubris, and that we need to resist that impulse. Article 14, I think, has been a wonderful protection for something that is a treasure for the people of New York. And I would say the first line is don't fool with it. We can do all kinds of other things to try to deal with this climate change. Unfortunately, it all comes from outside our borders, not all of it, but most of it. And we can't pass a law to do anything about that. But I think that large protected forests, for one thing, sequester a lot of carbon. And so keeping our forests intact to the extent that we can is absolutely essential. And that should be our first line in thinking about the Constitution and the Forest Reserve.
Well, Phil Terrie, depending on what comes out of it, maybe there's one more book in you.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much. We appreciate the conversation, and I'm going to turn things back over to Liz at the Adirondack Experience.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation. I know I did. And we invite you to join us again next month on Monday, November 3rd, when we will be welcoming photographer Russ Hartung, author of Adirondack Solitude, Peace and Stillness in the Adirondack Wilderness. To learn more and to register for upcoming events, visit theadkx.org/events. And if you'd like to pay us a visit in person, there is still time. The Adirondack Experience is open for one more week, with the final day of our 2025 season being Monday, October 13th. On behalf of all of us at the Adirondack Experience, I'm Liz Bellier. Thank you for spending your evening with us, and we will see you next month. Thanks, everyone.